You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up.
GQ's global fashion correspondent Samuel Hine is the twin brother who learned at a young age just how fashion can arm someone with the ability to establish their own identity. Having met his boss of 10 years, Will Welch, through a friend of his grandmother, the Chinese and history major has become a staple across our feeds in fashion's front rows. We talked about the glory days, both past and present, the human element essential to any good writing, the brands that seem to be winning by avoiding hype cycles and instead staying the course. And as the conversation around the new masculinity seems to continue, he isn't entirely sure if men are okay, but they're definitely buying clothes. This is Samuel Hine, and we're talking about what's contemporary now.
Samuel Hine, let's start at your beginning. Who was the boy, and does he live on in the man he's become today?
I hope so, at least a little bit. I was born in DC, but I grew up in the North Shore suburbs of Chicago. And I was always a pretty particular kid, especially when it came to clothing. I think my parents probably thought I was kind of crazy, but there were a couple of years, and I don't actually remember the reason why, but there were a couple of years where I refused to wear blue jeans. I had sweatshirts and sweaters that I was like so deeply attached to that if I lost them or left them at school, I would melt down. And I have a twin brother, an identical twin. So I think part of my early attraction to clothing was me trying to find some sort of identity, try to differentiate myself from my twin brother. We're extremely close. We always have been. We look very similar. I didn't love when people would call me by his name or vice versa. So I was always interested in ways to embody my own person somehow. As soon as I was old enough, I was dragging my mom to Urban Outfitters, American Apparel, and in the suburbs where I grew up, I was taking the train downtown to go thrift shopping. I didn't have any real conception of what fashion was. I was interested in the menswear industry, but I was mostly just interested in clothing. In high school, I was obsessed with rugby Ralph Lauren. I would just spend hours looking at Oxford button-downs and shaggy dog sweaters and things like that. Clothing has always been an important part of my life, and I didn't pursue clothing or writing in college. I was a Chinese major and a history major.
Oh, wow. What led to those choices?
I was more of a reader than a writer growing up. So history felt like sort of a natural extension of that, I guess. I was always pretty lousy at French. I took French up till high school, and my dad gave me the option before when I was selecting classes for high school. I went to a big public high school north of Chicago. He gave me the option to take French summer school to get better and prepare for the high school classes, or to switch to Mandarin. And I took the easy way out, what I thought was the easy way out, which ended up leading to 8 years of very arduous language study. But I really loved it and continue to love it to this day. My Mandarin's pretty rusty, but I've been fortunate enough to go to China a few times through work for fashion events. I was very happy to learn that the language skills have kind of been hibernating in my brain. As soon as I got there, it started coming back, which was helpful and nice to know.
You did mention that you were living in Chinatown earlier when we were chatting, and I'm guessing based on what you've just said, that's not giving you a chance to practice, because isn't that primarily Cantonese in Chinatown?
It's primarily Cantonese, yeah, but there's plenty of people who speak Mandarin, so I pick up things here and there. I never thought like, oh wow, after graduating, I want to move to China and try to get a job there, make a career there. Although I spent a little bit of time there through my studies and I really loved it. I always just knew that I was going to move to New York. I thought maybe one day I would do something with it, and luckily I do actually get to use it through. I work very closely with the Condé Nast China team, even at the shows and stuff. But I knew that I was going to move to New York. I loved having the time to study something that I wouldn't necessarily use in my day-to-day life. And I think studying Mandarin in particular, it felt to me like it kept my brain elastic or something. Memorization, and it's very foreign and feels very ancient and just a completely different system. So I thought there was something really valuable about it.
And where does one find a sudden pivot in the path from studying history and Chinese to pursuing writing as a career, especially in the fashion sector?
Yeah, so I was always really interested in media, maybe more so than writing at first. I was the head of my high school radio station, which sounds very nerdy. I thought it was pretty cool. I think one of the first quote unquote celebrities I ever got to interview was Liz Phair. We were doing a radiothon, a fundraiser for the station, 88.1. And Liz Phair went to my high school, and she was kind enough to call in and participate for an interview with me. And she said the funniest thing, which was like, wow, I never thought that I would be interviewed by my high school radio station. And I said, I thought I would never get to interview Liz Phair on my high school radio station. That was a moment where I recognized that media, whether as a writer or a journalist working at a radio station, whatever, was a way to access these worlds that really fascinated me, that I felt were quite far away from my very chill suburban upbringing. So then in college, I was an editor of my college newspaper. I ran a blog that sort of covered college news. I was becoming more and more obsessed as I was pursuing my studies. On one hand, I was becoming more and more obsessed with men's fashion and menswear. I was consuming everything that I could that was out there, all the Tumblr blogs. This was like the Tumblr and Blogspot era. I was reading all the Vogue Homme stuff. And I kind of realized that the fashion media ecosystem just didn't take men's fashion entirely as seriously as I guess I was taking it. There just wasn't a ton of coverage. It's certainly not like there is today. And at the time, the menswear world was just a much smaller business. But what I guess I recognized was that if I was becoming really obsessed with how I dressed, with the clothes that I wore, with what was out there, where it came from, then there must be millions of other people like me. And I connected with some of them on forums and stuff. I had friends who got into it along with me, and I thought I could do this. I have something to contribute to this world and to this generation, to my generation of kids who are spending hours trying to find the perfect pair of vintage Levi's on eBay or whatever, and who are interested in like what Raf Simons' deal is, how this Belgian avant-garde menswear designer ended up at Dior. So I sought out the most stylish professor that I could find. He was a medieval English professor, or medievalist in the English department. And I went up to him at our campus's one coffee shop. I went to a small school in the Berkshires. And I just said, I want to do an independent study with you about men's fashion. And he said, I don't really know anything about that, despite what my cool outfit might suggest, but let's do it. What do you got for me? So I ended up doing an independent study where I delved into the history and development of men's fashion criticism from like Oscar Wilde all the way to Tumblr blogs and stuff like that. And that was when it started really clicking for me that this was something that I desperately wanted to pursue somehow.
Yeah, that sounds like an incredible sort of precursor to everything that you've since accomplished. You've been in the GQ ecosystem for nearly a decade at this point, having started off as an editorial assistant. So what was the timeline or the steps taken post the story you've just shared in arriving at GQ?
The day I graduated, I got in a car, drove to New York. I had an internship at a menswear brand where I got paid in clothes. My plan was basically figure out what is going on in the New York men's fashion scene. And I quickly realized that it was a lot smaller than I had imagined and that everyone was connected by a few people. So eventually, after I did that and I was sort of messing around and trying to find a job, and I got in touch with Will Welch, who through a sort of a surprising mutual friend, which was a friend of my grandmother's who went to school with his mom. And I got an email from her and she said, this guy, Will, is looking to hire an assistant. And I said, great. And I went and I met him at his office and I started 2 weeks later. And actually, what I skipped over, something that I now recognize as a formative experience growing up, which was when I was, I think, 12 or 13, I visited New York with my parents. And one of my dad's best friends from college worked at Condé Nast, which is at the time at 4 Times Square. And I think she was an editor at Allure or Glamour or something. And we went and we visited her office. And I remember in the elevator just being surrounded by these beautiful, incredibly chic women who were just like embodied this like cosmopolitan glamour. It made me feel like I was in the center of the world in a way. Condé Nast always felt like this sort of beacon of taste. And so when I got the chance to meet Will and to join the team, I obviously leapt at it.
Absolutely. It feels like the perfect pairing, despite the fact that your formal education wasn't necessarily in that sector. But you also held roles such as style editor, you hosted the podcast, but most recently you've ascended to the role of global fashion correspondent. And obviously we're in a time where job titles are changing, new names are emerging, org structures are obviously very different than they once were at companies like Condé. But tell us about the kind of entirety of what your current role now entails.
I wish I could say that I came up with the job title, but I think that was Will. So it's always Fashion Week somewhere. As we know, my job is to go to where it is happening. I cover all the major fashion weeks now for GQ, which includes the men's shows in January and June, the women's shows in February and September. And they're technically the women's shows, but a lot of brands have moved to co-ed formats. So there's a lot of important menswear to see during those weeks as well. So I spend a lot of time on a plane. I feel very fortunate that I get to be in these spaces and spend a lot of time with some of the brightest fashion critics around and spend a lot of time interviewing the designers who are showing us their work. I go where the action is in between the major fashion weeks. So a Montclair show in Shanghai, or Heider Ackerman is hosting a camping trip in southern Utah. So I'm in between the shows, I'm covering the big stories and the things that are popping up. When I'm in New York, I'm primarily in the office and focused on writing features for the print magazine, writing shorter lead stories for the website. I started as Will's assistant, and every job from that one onward has, in some ways, the responsibilities have evolved. The business has changed, the magazine's changed a lot. But my role has always been, in some ways, to do a little bit of everything. And I still feel that way. In a really positive sense, I love having a hand in a bunch of different parts of the magazine: print, web, social, video. I'm in all of our events meetings. We're planning our end of year Man of the Year party. It's our 30th anniversary this year, and I've been involved in that. And I pitch stories for other people. And I've always liked just taking on different roles at the magazine in order to help make things happen. When I was Will's assistant, I was unfortunately not very good at that part of the job, because I almost always had my head in my computer writing something, researching stuff for a story I wanted to pitch. I was running GQ Style social media channels. At one point I was running GQStyle.com, which was the quarterly luxury magazine that Will was the editor-in-chief of before becoming the editor-in-chief of GQ. And I loved it. I just loved getting my hands dirty every day in the content mines, if you will. Yeah, the job's a little different now. It's certainly more global. We work really closely with the 13 global GQ markets that are published around the world. I lead the style teams of those magazines in our coverage. I coordinate with them really closely on designer profiles and different priorities for coverage. They always feed me really great ideas. I hope I bat a few back at them too. Travel is one thing, but fashion is so global, and the role is very global in that I work closely with and rely a lot on our teams in Paris, in Milan, in Spain, in Japan. We have great style editors all over the world.
Well, that was another question I was going to ask in terms of the global aspect of the role. Are you then overseeing some of those voices in these other markets, or are you just contributing globally?
How I would put it is I lead our coverage, our fashion and style coverage. I don't oversee them in a managerial sense, more in an editorial sense. And they have a lot of independence to do things that they think are right for their local markets, but we collaborate constantly. It's a lot of ideation. They feed me a lot of intel that they're hearing that can help inform my reporting and my storytelling. I think, like a lot of things in the magazine business, every day is a little different. Just how I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever read Graydon's When the Going Was Good or The Empire of the Elite?
I read Graydon's first, and then I read Keith McNally's memoir. And then I've started Michael's book, and I think I just got to the part where Anna arrives on the scene. So I haven't finished it yet, but it's at the top of my big pile of books I need to get through.
Reading through those stories, are there any parts of that bygone era that you wished you'd been able to live through firsthand?
I mean, Condé Nast during the Roaring '20s sounded incredible. So that would have been pretty fun to experience. And who wouldn't want an interest-free mortgage? That would be nice. And I'm not just saying this, but like I genuinely do feel some of that magic is still around. When I started GQ, I was working closely with people who worked really closely with Art Cooper. And I've seen Condé Nast change a lot in the last almost 10 years. But the one thing that has remained really constant, which I think really animates both of those books, is that everyone who works at these magazines really is passionate about the work that they do and works really hard at developing their own taste and then pouring that taste into the magazines that then get sent out to millions of people. And that is definitely still true about GQ today. And that's why I've stayed here for so long and why I love working here, because that part of the real passion and the drive and the energy, the black cars have more or less gone away. The clothing allowances, I don't even know what that is, but the work is still really important to people here. And I think that really comes through in the product. I feel like it's my golden age here. I don't know. To me, I'm living in the golden age.
That's a fantastic perspective and one we should all have. And I don't think that sort of revering the past means that you don't necessarily love the present. I think it's only that hindsight will always be 20/20, and we normalize the environments in the absence of, well, maybe not everyone, because to your point of having passion, you're in that moment, right? It's all happening now. But sometimes there are things that one might imagine being quite exciting to experience firsthand. Now, another thing that's been really interesting in journalism, and that's not to say it's unprecedented, there have certainly been other examples over the years, but there is this kind of requirement to be outward facing in a way where you're visible, you're active on social media in the way that you are. And I wouldn't assume you to be an introvert, but you're certainly not overly extroverted from what I can tell. And so I was curious as to how you felt about that aspect of your role and kind of the visibility required.
Yeah, I never really thought about it in a super deliberate way because I always understood the role of fashion editor, of Condé Nast fashion editor or fashion writer or fashion correspondent, whatever, as being more than just a 9 to 5, as being really not a job you did, but like a person you were or a person you became. So when I thought of Condé Nast, I thought of Graydon Carter and Anna and these larger than life figures who embodied everything their magazine was about. And so I guess I aspired to that. And I don't know how deliberately I thought about putting myself out there. I think naturally, I always felt like going out was a big part of my job because it's hard to report on what people are wearing, what people are talking about, what's happening in fashion, what's happening in style if you're not going in and seeing what's going on and being in these spaces where culture is created in New York and around the world. And I think being out a lot has certainly contributed to that, I suppose. But I certainly don't have a particularly well-honed strategy behind my social media usage or anything. I like to use it to promote my work. I like to post cool outfits that I'm wearing every so often. People seem to like that a lot. And that's cool by me because I've just always naturally felt my role here has been so much more than a 9 to 5 and closer to the lifestyle. So yeah, to me, that it feels pretty natural, I guess. And I think honestly, it's important because it helps engender real trust with readers. I certainly feel more of a connection to a story if I know who the person is who wrote it, if I know what they're like, if I know how they dress, all these things. If I feel a little bit closer to them than maybe just a sort of a standard byline. So I hope people feel that way about me, and that being maybe more visible does help solidify that trust that I think I share with readers.
Well, certainly in the case that you're in pursuit of those archetypes you've described, right? Because I think we all grew up with these idol-like editors who did seem larger than life and definitely had an authority over the subject matter that they traded upon just because we all knew who they were. And they had these sort of very bold and established, unique, individualistic identities that really felt aspirational. And some might argue that we've seen a bit of a decline in how prevalent those roles are, just in terms of how things have been organized. But I love everything you said, and I think it makes a great deal of sense. So as we kind of live through this era of Substack, where your interests can really be curated according to your tailor-made interests, as opposed to something like legacy media, which is going to cater to a broader spectrum of subject matter, how do you think a title like GQ fits into that cultural landscape as these other platforms sort of emerge with much more independent voices, which I guess in a way is reminiscent of blogger culture, but you tell me.
Yeah, I think GQ, one thing I've always really loved about this place is that we have a huge audience. And I love when stories that I write are read by a ton of people. And I think that what we're quite good at is plugging in really interesting, unique voices into the GQ machine that can then promote the work and put it in front of thousands, millions of people, whether it's on the website or in print. And one thing that I saw this coming, I think a lot of people did years ago, that the ways that we were consuming media and finding it, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, that was all going away. And the game was going to be about developing a direct relationship with readers and being in their inboxes, being on their social feeds. And so in 2022, I think it was, I launched my own newsletter at GQ called Show Notes. And that was because I wanted to review fashion shows. I wanted to interview more or less unknown niche designers. I wanted to write about the things that were happening off the runway, brands hiring rain shamans in Paris to make sure that their shows didn't get rained on, things that maybe don't have the biggest, most general audience in the world, but who have a small but very dedicated and very hungry audience. So the newsletter has been a really great tool because there's nothing I can write that's like too specific or too niche or too underground. Almost the more specific I go, the more my Show Notes subscribers like it. And that has been like totally freeing for me because I don't have to worry so much about SEO and about how this is going to play out and like the wilds of the internet as a whole. I can tailor things for my interests, which is what my followers want from the newsletter. I think Substack's a really interesting platform. I like that it's become a place for a lot of writers to talk, sort of use as like a small scale Twitter or something. I think honestly, the more there is to read and the more readers there are, the better for everyone. And the more conversation there is around these things like fashion, I think that just drives a lot of energy through the whole system. I love having Show Notes as my little corner of the GQ world and the fashion world. And yeah, I guess it's been like 3 years now, which is crazy. I initially planned it as, I think, a daily newsletter, which seems
very ambitious.
It became too ambitious. And then now I see people like Emily Sundberg on Substack who does do a daily newsletter. And I think maybe it's not so crazy. So during Fashion Week, during the most recent men's season in June, I did send Show Notes every day. which was very hardcore, but was also just a ton of fun because I had always been feeling like there was more shows and more stories and more people that I wanted to cover that I didn't have time to. Emily's contributes to GQ often. She's a friend. And I think what I learned from her was if you hold yourself to it, you just find time and you do it. And it was the most fun I've had of any season I've covered so far.
You did mention the conversation around fashion and the importance of kind of feeding that proverbial beast. And I think we've seen a lot of examples where that rhetoric turns into a spotlight on the downfall of luxury and earnings drops and the expose on the quality of production from X brand, Y brand, whatever it might be. But then you have brands like Ralph Lauren who are reporting unprecedented heights in their stock values. So why do you think that is?
One thing I'll say is I think what we've seen in this most recent season of fashion shows is that fashion is back. I think there had been the industry as a whole had gone through a real period it really felt like we were sort of in the creative doldrums. Spending was down. You sort of listed some of the things that were happening. It felt like the cool creative brands weren't really getting any attention, and the big brands that were getting attention weren't really stepping up to the plate. And I felt like things after the sort of great designer reshuffle we've seen in the past year. And I think there's a legitimate debate to be had over is it really new, given that most people that we already sort of know switch jobs rather than a whole class of unknown fresh faces joining. But I felt like it was a really inspiring and creative season where a lot of these designers whose work we are very familiar with push themselves to new places. I think the industry really needed that. I can't tell you how frustrating it is to be at a fashion show and just hear only people complaining around you. I try very hard not to complain at fashion shows. I try to reflect as much as I can on how lucky I am to be there and how it's what I'd always wanted to do, even when I'm squeezed between two people and half a seat and it's 100,000 degrees and I'm sweating through my suit. But it had been let's call it a year or so where I think things had been a little bit, there were obviously bright pockets, but the general vibe was not so good. And Ralph is a great example of someone who just made all the right moves. Ralph is so consistent that he doesn't even have to do a men's fashion show to be the coolest thing in menswear. And the brand has invested a lot of money in cleaning up its supply chains and refocusing on retail and investing in the luxury positioning of the clothing or whatever. But really what I think happened in Ralph's case specifically is the culture kind of moved back in his direction. He didn't go chasing new relevance, chasing clout, whatever you want to call it. The company's just honed and refreshed what it does really well. And in time, people sort of recognize that, oh, maybe that's what's really cool right now. Maybe integrity and style and this world is what we're after. I think that was all happening basically independently of all these wider designer shifts and stuff, which I think is really cool. I love that Ralph has just remained this beacon of American style for over 50 years. And that people are seeing it with new eyes and really appreciating it in a new way today.
Jumping into Europe and going back to what you had just mentioned about all of these new roles being played by different designers coming from different houses and all these debut collections we saw, which of them stood out most to you?
So in September, we saw 4 big debuts in Milan: Gucci, Jill Sander, Versace, and Bottega Veneta, all with new designers. In Paris, there were a bunch more. And my favorite, and I think anyone who reads show notes probably knows this already, but was Dario Vitale's debut at Versace. I went into it with not really any expectations at all. He was the number 2 at Miu Miu. So people didn't really know what his signature moves were. I had never met him before. I've been to a bunch of Versace shows, and it was always a very specific type of thing, very Donatella, very va-va-voom, lots of stilettos and slit dresses and crazy printed silk shirts, which is a vibe for sure. And then Dario came out with a vision that just felt totally different, super young, super new. I was really I was sold by look 6 or 9 or something. There was these purple jeans, there were these lime green pants, there was a blue blazer, a sort of electric blue blazer. There's all these colors that felt really 80s Miami. It felt very Gianni Versace. It felt like things that people I know want to wear right now, including myself. I was mentally placing a personal order during that show, which is pretty rare, honestly. And that just felt totally fresh. I walked away from that show really energized and really excited for what that could mean for the rest of the industry. And I hope that he gets the support he needs and gets to keep going.
Yeah, no, I feel like a lot of people really enjoyed his show, and it definitely felt like a departure worth noticing and promising for what that means in terms of the months ahead. But if you were to strip back all of the hype cycles, and I'm not saying that's one of them, but what or who do you think would still matter in fashion?
I think if all of the discourse around fashion went away, what you would be left with is people who really passionately use clothing to express something about themselves, to find themselves, to develop a lifestyle for themselves. You would have designers who couldn't possibly do anything else but make clothes. When I think about people who are just born for this, who would be doing this even if there was no money in it, if there was no press, if there was no fame, if there was no anything, you'd have people like Mike Eckhouse and Zoe Lada, of Eckhouse Lada, who are just beyond talented and freakishly obsessed with all things fashion in a way that I think is totally contagious. Every time I spend any time with them, I'm like, oh my God, you're right. This Mugler collection from whatever is the most important thing that's ever happened. Or someone like Kiko Kostadinov, who's just has such a brilliant, unorthodox take on menswear, and who would, I think, literally be sewing this stuff in a garage if he had to. He would just be even if he had ended up doing any other job, he would be at his house making clothes for himself or for his friends or whatever. And to me, those are the people who kind of drive fashion forward. Telfar is another great example, right? Just participated in the fashion world and then just retreated and built his own world of style and of status symbols with very little regard for what fashion thought of him. Dipped out of Fashion Week. That's the future of fashion to me, is these people who literally cannot help themselves but be fashion designers. And that enthusiasm, that drive, that energy, I think really does spur a really dynamic feeling through the rest of the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely palpable. And I think the universal excitement around the appointment of Grace Wills-Bonner at Hermès for men's was such a beautiful example of exactly what you're describing. What do you think that one's going to entail as a storyline, even if we have to wait an entire year to find out?
Shout out Grace, someone who worked so hard for this and who was really patient. I don't know 100%, but I'm almost certain that she's had many offers to go places before this. And I really respect that she has just been able to stay so focused on developing her brand, her artistic practice, really. 'Cause I think of her more almost as much like an artist as a fashion designer. Being the creative director of Hermès menswear, that is the perfect role for her. It's funny, it's the one appointment of the dozen plus in the last year where there was very little debate or polarization about it online, just genuine enthusiasm for a very good pairing. So I cannot wait to see what she does. Yeah, I'm already counting down to January 2027. It's cool that she is taking her time and that Hermès is encouraging her to take her time and familiarize herself with the house and with the craftspeople and with the capabilities. And I think just the idea of her going into the silk studio and going into the leather house and going into all these, I don't know, I want to see Grace Wills-Bonner Hermès ceramics in the collection somehow. It's Hermès is such a unique place because they have these different métiers and different artisanal world-class workshops and things. Grace is just so engaged with artisanality and the act of creation and where things come from and what it means. And so how she applies that to Hermès menswear is I think, going to be really thrilling.
Yeah, I don't think anyone doubts how huge it will be. But in the vein of menswear, that industry in terms of particular categories has certainly been growing faster than women's recently. And I wanted to hear your thoughts as to why that was, as far as larger investment on the marketing side, or is it just shifts in consumer behavior culturally, or why do you think men's is suddenly growing so fast?
I think we're living through a real revolution in masculinity, almost like a continuation of what I was experiencing when I was in high school, where all of a sudden I felt like I had license to care about how I dressed, how I looked. Menswear has totally flourished as men have embraced this idea that men can and should care about how they look and can and should creatively express themselves through clothing. Menswear is still much smaller than women's wear as an industry, but as you said, growing much faster. Because, there are millions of men who represent this sort of untapped consumer base. They're coming to GQ. We see this happen. They come to GQ because maybe they start reading GQ Recommends and buying themselves some staple, business casual work clothes or whatever. If that's the sort of the door kind of cracking open, then maybe a profile of maybe the Travis Kelce profile is kind of opens the door a little wider. They're like, oh, they look at what he's wearing. Oh, that's interesting. What's this brand? And maybe eventually they end up subscribing to show notes because they have discovered this like world they didn't know all that much about. I think we're living through a real kind of masculine renaissance. And we just did a print issue fronted by Glenn Powell that really digs into this phenomenon. And we call it the new masculinity because we did a new masculinity issue in, I think, 2019, which is the one where Pharrell Williams is on the cover wearing Valentino Moncler dress, like dress coat robe thing. And that was a moment where this was all coming to a head. And then it's developed in all these bizarre and somewhat unpredictable ways since then, given the wider political context and social context and things like that, and the rise of men's podcasts and the manosphere and whatever. So, in putting together this issue, we were just thinking a lot about, okay, what is GQ's position in this new world of masculinity? What do we have to say about it? Emily Sundberg interviewed a few dozen college-aged men about what it was like to be them to be a Gen Z college kid in 2025. I profiled Jonathan Anderson to get his very fascinating perspective on masculinity and fashion and how he plays with the two, or how he plays with masculinity in his work. So it's something that we think about all the time is where are men headed? What's going on? And I think as things have changed in the past 10 years, what I feel very proud of is that GQ has like always been there for these men at whatever stage in their sort of process of discovering like what it means to be a man today, what a man should be like today, how a man should dress today, that we've been there as a resource, as a source of entertainment, as a source of knowledge. So I don't know if men are okay, but they're definitely buying clothes. So that's good.
That was a really good pull quote. You did mention one of the examples of content in GQ that people might funnel through on their journey of consumerism. But as a reader and a writer, what do you think makes for a good profile? Because obviously it's challenging to frame someone within those confines.
Tell me about it. Sometimes when I'm in the middle of a profile, when I'm like knee deep, I think to myself, why do I do this? And as my friend Nomi Fry said in a podcast recently, isn't being a writer so embarrassing? But no, I do love writing profiles because even no matter how hard it is, eventually it all comes together. What makes a really good profile is on the most fundamental level, it's access, which can be hard these days. But a really great one I read the other day was Nate Freeman at Vanity Fair profiling Richard Prince, who hasn't given an interview in 10 plus years, and told Nate that he was not going to give any more interviews after this. And just getting into like the creative universe of this like enigmatic, radical American artist, I like loved every word of that profile. And for me, it's like that access is huge. I love a profile where like the sort of typical setup is you want to sit down with them for a couple hours, you want to go do something fun with them, whatever. And a lot of that, the sort of like trope of like a magazine cover story is like such and such actor and writer go to a pottery class or something, which like not that has any real connection to like the subject necessarily, but it's like a weird situation that could kind of make for something unexpected happening. And I actually I like it when a profile is set up in a way where the reporting is set up in a way where kind of anything can happen, because that gets the subject in a place where they might be disarmed and maybe a little bit more real. I think more importantly, it gets the writer in a place where they don't know what might come out of the person's mouth, or they don't know where things are going to go. And, when that type of situation is really carefully observed, I love that as a reader. And I also know how sort of hard it is to hit those notes. One thing that I worked on recently that I'm like so unbelievably proud of, it was an interesting exercise because I was profiling Virgil Abloh like in absentia. Obviously he passed away in 2021, but I got the opportunity to go visit his archive in the Midwest. I sort of thought that the story would be about a lot of stuff because he had over his career just amassed like unbelievable number of objects that he designed and he collected. There's like 20,000 items in all in these facilities. But what I ended up writing was something that felt much more personal to him. It wasn't like profile length, but I felt like I came away with a much clearer understanding of him somehow through this sort of very like profound experience of sorting through like basically all of his worldly possessions. That was just a much different experience that I'm used to, but an incredibly rewarding one. And I think I learned a lot from that story.
I feel like a lot of writers always say that it's a love-hate relationship, right? Because they definitely have things to say. They definitely are curious people and they're fascinated by the things that they end up writing about. But the process of writing can be quite arduous and painful and all of the things. Do you find that to be true?
Yeah, just when I think it's going to get easier, I'm always proven wrong. And luckily I've been doing it long enough to know that when I'm having a lot of trouble with something, it probably means that my reporting isn't all the way done yet. And I have to go back out and talk to someone again or make fewer calls, whatever. But I absolutely have a love-hate relationship with writing. It feels like I have homework assigned every day for the rest of my life, but nothing really comes close to the feeling of really cracking a story, or that moment when like the sort of light bulb goes off when you're talking to someone, or when I was at the Virgil Abloh archive, there were like moments like that around every corner where I was like, oh my God, this prototype sample of a harness that no one's ever seen, like totally teaches me, like I'm learning something about Virgil, like every box I open. That is just the most rewarding feeling. And I think that's why we all keep coming back. I keep saying that writing is hard. It is, but in the age of AI, I've also come to think of it as a much more noble activity than I think maybe I once did. I think a real person writing real things is like an art and a craft that is in danger. And I am proud that I do it every day. And I take my hat off to anyone who is in the same vocation, because we got to keep doing it. We can't let machines do all the magazine profiles.
No, and I think at this point, we've started to become sufficiently well-versed in detecting AI-generated language, and the human tonality is more valuable today than ever before. And even Tish Weinstock in her episode was talking about enjoying mistakes and just flaws and human error and different things that actually make what it is you're reading much more engaging. Before we kind of motion towards our last question, it feels like an opportunity to explore your thoughts on style culture. And you travel so much in your global role. Obviously, that's something you can speak to across the globe. So what is your perspective on the pros and cons of style cultures across major cities that still serve as that sort of barometer of taste and culture? We can start with New York.
I wish that there was like a word to describe how people in New York dress, because it's like so purposeful, but so casual. I think, especially, and I'm talking mostly sort of downtown where I live, but every day I'm like amazed by just how grungy and incredible everyone looks, and how much thought people put into dressing so far down. And I don't know, in New York, like I wore a full suit to work today, and I walked out of my apartment. I just felt so out of place in a cool way, because people have just embraced like this like really sleazy, dirt baggy, almost like pseudo preppy even like style, where everyone's wearing vintage and archival fashion and stuff that's just like tattered. Distressed clothing isn't even how to put it anymore. It's people wearing t-shirts that are like spider web with holes. It's like, I acknowledge that I'm like probably not that much older than these kids in my neighborhood, and it's so far advanced from what I'm into. But I just think it's like, I don't know, it just brings me a lot of joy to see how like innovative people can look in a way where they're just trying to like look like they put absolutely zero like negative effort into their outfits. It's like skater culture meets fashion meets like archival meets handyman core meets like I found these Carhartt pants in the trash or whatever. Yeah, I love New York for that. I love New York. Like I feel like I see someone wearing something in a totally new way like every time I leave my apartment. And I think like the way that clothes fit in New York is, I think people really care about how their clothes fit. Maybe too much. But I have this sense that like New Yorkers really, like a lot of New Yorkers have a very close relationship with their tailor, maybe, no matter what they're wearing, whether it's like a pair of tattered jeans or a suit or something. I love Paris because Parisians really dress up, and I love dressing up, and I love putting a suit on and walking out the door and spending the day in the city. And I feel like there's a real dignity to, Parisian style culture. I'm trying to think of what else, some other cities.
Surely London is in the mix somewhere.
Yeah, London. I don't spend that much time in London, but usually when I'm in Italy or sometimes in France, people ask me how London is.
Yeah, you do look English.
Because I think it's really the haircut. So I guess what I can say about London is that people care about having cool hair, which is important. And I also care about having cool hair. My favorite style city that I've been to recently is Shanghai.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because Shanghai just has like an absolutely incredible flourishing youth fashion scene and youth style culture. And I think it's because these kids, like, they have money, but they also have taste. So they really just go like all out and pursue whatever their niche fascination is, like to the nth degree. And I think that's really cool. Yeah, but you find inspiration everywhere you can, as long as you're looking for it.
Amidst all of your commentary on these kind of unique approaches to style, do you still believe that things like staple items exist in terms of what people should have in their wardrobe, or is that era over?
I think everyone should have staple items in their wardrobe. It's just one person's idea of a staple item might be totally different from mine. And that's great. I don't want people to look the same. I don't think people should dress the same. Tom Ford has I forget where this is published and when exactly, but he has a sort of infamous list of like things that every man needs to own. One of them's like nice teeth or something, and like a black suit and a pair of underwear for every day of the week. Pretty like standard, very like sagacious stuff. And that's like a great place to start. If that's where you need to start, awesome. But there's no one playbook or rule book for men anymore.
I love that. And what is contemporary now?
I believe that what is contemporary now is print media. It is an antiquated medium, some might say, but in this age of algorithms and social media feeds and just endless screen time all day, every day, nothing makes my brain feel more relaxed and actually reinvigorated than when I get to lie on my couch before I go to bed and crack open GQ or Vanity Fair or Vogue or The New Yorker or New York or the new issue of High Stability or whatever, and tap in with a physical product that's made by people who are arbiters of taste in their own way and who are very passionate and very skilled at putting those things out into the world. I think one of the antidotes to internet brain rot is print magazines. It just is, because there's no algorithm. The algorithm is people's taste, and tapping in with people's taste helps you develop your own taste, your own personality, the things that you're interested in, how you want to dress, how you want to eat, how you want to live. And I think we all need to remember that like we are human and that should be celebrated. And these like human physical things should be cherished. To me, it feels a print magazine is a product of an old time, but it feels newly more relevant. To me, it feels more relevant than ever. So I'm happy I get to make one.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for your time, Samuel. It was great chatting.
Thanks so much, Christopher. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our producer, Sasha Grinblatt. Audio post-production by Chase Coughlin with original theme music by Joseph Topp-Miller and Chase Coughlin of The Black Soft. And visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes each week. And if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for additional content and join the conversation. Let us know what you think is contemporary now.